Good morning, everybody. My name is Ben Smith, and I'm here to talk to you about hacking with gems. Should be an entertaining talk. I hope you guys enjoy it. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about who I am. I'm a Rails developer. I've been doing it since Rails 1.16 professionally. I work for Pivotal Labs these days, and I'd like to thank them for sending me here. Getting a full ride from them is awesome. I couldn't do it without them. And I'm currently in Boulder, Colorado, where it was actually snowing on Saturday when I left. So it's nice to enjoy some warm weather before I have to embrace the winter for good. It's also nice to be back here because I was actually born just next door, and I haven't been back since I was 12. So it's a little bit of a reunion for me. So that's who I am. I'd also like to talk a little bit about what I'm not. I'm not a security expert. I have a fascination in security, but no training, no background. I like going to DEF CON every year, but 90% of the content there goes straight over my head. And I want you to keep that in mind during this talk, because I'm not some uber elite hacker that's coming up with these things. I'm just a Rails developer, and I had some ideas, and it turned out those ideas were really easy for me to implement. So anyone can do this stuff. That being said, please don't try this at home. It would actually be better if you forgot everything I'm about to tell you, except for maybe the last 4 or 5 slides. This talk is a little bit conflicted. On the one hand, I'm telling you how to avoid being hacked and things you should look out for. And on the other hand, I'm showing you exactly what to do if you want to compromise other people's systems. This picture doesn't really convey that very well. If you look at this and you say, like, that looks like a horrible idea. Why would anyone ever do that? Actually, a lot of these things are kind of fun. And they kind of feel like, wow, that's pretty neat. I should try that. Don't do that. Please don't do that. So about a year ago, I had a client, and this client asked, what are the dependencies of my app? He wanted to have some handle on what was going on, and was a little bit worried about having too many dependencies that were maybe shady or he wasn't certain on. So I showed him the gemfile.log. There's a Rails app, and that satisfies curiosity. But it got me wondering, what's the worst that could happen? What could a malicious gem do? And what's the worst possible thing that could happen to this client? And I thought, well, this client has customers, and if the customer's private data got leaked out, got compromised, everyone might lose faith in the product and it would completely fail. So I thought, how hard would it be to write a gem that would do that? So I wrote this gem, awesome Rails flash messages. I decided that no one would actually install a gem that would openly just hack you, right? It has to be something that appeared to do something else, something useful, but behind the scenes was actually doing something bad. It's arguable whether or not this gem is actually useful, but anyways, it takes Rails flash messages, and makes them more awesome. All capitals, random set of exclamation points and some ones. Much better and totally useful, maybe. But this gem has some side effects. If you poked around the code, you might notice some odd things like this line. So if params 2s matches some base 64 decoded string, if that evaluates to true, it writes the params to something called development.log in your Rails public directory. And then just for good measure, it also writes the params out to some web service. So going back to that if statement, if params 2s matches something, that actually translates to if it matches password. So anytime the Rails app receives a request that contains password in it, so that would be the login page or the registration page, it writes to that development.log file and posts to a web service. So that development.log file, which I'll remind you is in the public directory, where you can publicly access it, ends up having clear text, emails, and passwords. They're not filtered like the real development.log. These are clear text. And of course, it also ends up someplace else on the internet. So now if I wanted to, I could start throwing these at banking websites. But that wouldn't work, right? Because nobody reuses their passwords here. So that would piss my client off if that happened to him. But I also thought, that was really easy. I wonder what else I can do. So I wrote another gem. This one I called net HTTP detector. And I wrote it to detect the hack that I had done previously. So from the awesome Rails flash messages, I decided, how could I write a gem to kind of detect and see what's going on in my app? So this little gem logs calls to net HTTP and would basically show you what's going on when you started using that awesome Rails flash message gem. So you'd see either in your standard out or in your Rails log file, you'd see something like this where it says, post form happened. It got some params that includes this URL to someplace on the internet, and here's what it posted. It posted everything from your params, including the email and password. It's not very pretty, but it shows what's going on. And how this works is it basically overwrites post form to log out what's happening, and it also defines a valid post form so that if you have HTTP calls in your app, you can call them without having this logging happen. But it also does one more thing. On one of the last lines of one of the files, there's this little snippet of code. And what this is doing is it's going out to some web service, grabbing something and evaluating it. Ruby's great. Eval's so much fun. You just grab stuff and have it turn into Ruby code. So what code is it grabbing and evaluating? Well, it's grabbing some code that adds a before filter, and it looks for a parameter DB console. And if it finds it, it does some active record stuff. So if you took a normal Rails route and you added a DB console parameter, you'd end up with a nice little interface to the database. So now you can do things like show me all the users, make myself an admin, or better yet, make me a database admin. So the moral of this story is careful of wolves in sheep's clothing. If you actually want to do network monitoring, there's tools out there like Snitch. This one shows your network traffic from all your processes. So here you can see that iTerm is running Ruby, and Ruby made a request out to this Heroku app. This is definitely much more what you'd want to use rather than this net HTTP detector. So I got emails and passwords. I got database access. My client would be horrified if he found out this was happening. But that was all easy. There's got to be something else I can do. I actually don't own a cat, but after all of the talks here, I feel like I needed cat pictures. So last night, I started Google image searching for cats that look mean. So that was easy. What else can I do? I have database access. I have usernames and passwords. What else? I wrote another gem, better date 2s. And what this one claims to do is it takes the date formats of Rails and strips out the extraneous white space. So you see that bottom line has an extra white space, gets rid of that. Kind of annoying thing that Rails does with its date formats. You might be catching on now. None of these gems actually do what they claim to do. It's all just misdirection, kind of magic. What this actually does, it calls this method set date formats for and passes it the Rails environment, the Rails root. Looks a little strange. So let's look at that method, set date formats for. So there's a method. It's not readable. It's not readable because that's this compiled C extension. It was packaged without the source. It only contains the compiled code. And so you have no way of actually seeing what it does. But since I wrote it, and I know what it does, I'll show you. This is the source before it was compiled and packaged into the gem. Can anyone tell me what this does? So if I ran this in production, and only in production because I don't want this showing up like when you go to use your version control. Only in production, when you run this, you end up with this assets.tar.gz in your public directory. And if I were to come along and download that tarball and extract it, I'd end up with something like this. That's your Rails source code. So now I've grabbed all the source code of your app. I have your intellectual property. So now I have your passwords, I have database access, and your entire app. But to be honest, this gem actually doesn't work. It could, but I'm kind of lazy. It's what's called a fat gem. Fat gems are gems that are pre-compiled for specific platforms, and there's tools to do all this work, but in the afternoon that I tried to get it to work, I just gave up. I decided, that's too hard. What else can I do that's easier? So I wrote another gem. Be truthy. How much truth do you guys think this will have? So RSpec is great, but the matchers are a little bit, they're kind of liars. When you say that should be true, it's not actually asserting that something is true or false. It's truthy or falsy. And that's kind of annoying to me, so I decided to write this RSpec matcher. So when you say true.should be true, that passes. But user.new should be true, that shouldn't pass. User.new should be truthy, that's what you want. So what does it actually do? It actually doesn't do anything. There's no functionality at all. Could be I just haven't gotten to implementing it yet, but it's actually because I got tired of writing these useful gems, and I decided to go straight for the hack. But if there's nothing there, then where's the hack? If we look at the source tree, it looks okay. Nothing out of the ordinary here. The source code looks good, because like I said, there's nothing there. So that's the btruthy.rb. So where's the catch? When you install this guy, it tells you building native extensions, this could take a while. Now what that usually means is it's compiling some C extension locally on your machine. But when we look at the source tree, there's no C files yet. There's nothing to compile. And when you think about it, RSpec matchers probably don't need C to run. Might be a red flag. So let's dig around a little more. This is the gem spec for this gem. And this line, gem extensions, it's usually used for compiling C extensions. But in this case, it's telling it to run the Rakefile at install time. And keep in mind that this is at install time, not when you require the gem, not when you execute the code. This is when you do gem install, this Rakefile gets run. But if we look back at the source tree again, there is no Rakefile. It's just not there. So where'd it go? So out of curiosity, how many people read the source code of any gems that they think might be a little shady? Do people do that? Some people do that. OK. So how many of you, before you ever gem install, you do a gem fetch, gem unpack, and then look at the source code, and then if it looks OK, then you install the gem? Does anybody do that? You look at GitHub. Oh my goodness. We'll get to that later. So, gem fetch. When you do a gem install or use bundle on your app, it immediately downloads and installs the gem. That's just what it does by default. If you don't want to install the gem, you have to use gem fetch, and you give it the gem, and it'll download it for you and won't install it. And then from there, you can use gem unpack, which will expand out that gem, and you can see what the contents are. And that doesn't install it either. So that gives you the gem that you're installing pre-installed. So if we unpack this btruthy gem, what do we actually see? Well, it's a little bit different. There's a couple extra files here. So there's that missing Rakefile, and there's also this file temp.rb. So first of all, what does the Rakefile do? This was the Rakefile that ran at install time. Right? So when we did a gem install, this Rakefile ran. Let's take a look. It copies that temp.rb into your home directory and hides it as .temp. It then proceeds to add a sudo, or an alias for sudo to your bash profile and points sudo at that new .temp file. And lastly, it removes itself. So that line there basically says, whatever file is executing, just remove yourself. So that's why we didn't see it after we did the gem install. The only evidence that it was ever there was that little compiling, native extensions when you ran the gem install, or if you dug down into the gem spec that single line. There's actually tools that can help you catch something like this. fseventer is one of those. You can turn it on and it'll watch for file system changes. So this is pretty nice. You can start it up, do a gem install, and in this case, it'll tell you, hey, your .profile changed, and hey, there's a .temp file. You might want to go check those things out. So back to the gem, that Rakefile alias sudo to run something in .temp. So the question is, what does sudo do now? It kind of does what sudo normally does. Prints out a warning, grabs your password, and then it runs the real sudo with whatever you wanted to run it with. So it acts like it would normally. But of course, that second step, it grabbed your password. So now that it has your password, it can do a lot more. And it does. It enables SSH. It creates a user and sets their password. And then lastly, it posts to a web service and says, hey, there's a box out here, and it's ready to be SSH'd into. So now what can I do? Now I own your box. So this is the takeaway. I presented some of these gems at a lightning talk at Mountain West, and this was the biggest takeaway from people. They were tweeting at me, never install Ben's gems. I'm never going to install your gems. I don't care. And yeah, that's valid. It's probably a good thing to not do. But how can I get around that? How many people here have published gems of their own? Nice. Sweet. So my next question is, how can I get you guys, those other gem authors, to run my code? You guys are smart, so you're not going to install gems that you don't trust, which is good. But what gems are trustworthy? Rails, that's probably trustworthy. RSpec, Sinatra, those all seem safe. You also have to trust all their dependencies, but chances are the big guys like that, you can probably say they're safe to install. So how can I add my code to some of these just trusted gems? You guys don't trust my gems now. I think it's safe to make that bet. So why don't I just add my code to some already trusted gems? And with this thought, let's go back to that btruthy gem. This does one more thing. At install time, it grabs your gem cutter credentials and your list of installed gems and posts it to a web service. So now guess what? Now I own your gems. And hopefully you guys write trustworthy gems that are useful, that I can add my code to. Because the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clone your repo. I'm going to add my code to your gem. I'm going to build your gem, and I'm going to push it. And this isn't like a new gem. This pushes to your Ruby gems. This is a new version of your gem. So if you're the maintainer, if you have gem push rights on RSpec, I could do this, and I could push a new version of RSpec. And the kicker is, you wouldn't even know it. There's no notification when a new gem is pushed. So I could do that, and unless you go to rubygems.org and look at the version, or you run gem update or something, you'd never know that I did this. And all that happened just by grabbing that little gem API key and the gem credentials file. So, do people trust your gems? And do people who install your gems have trustworthy gems? So once I hack your gems, and your friends install your gems, then I hack their gems, and it goes bigger and bigger and bigger, and it becomes viral to some extent, right? And then you ask the question, how many steps would it take for me to get from my gems to one of the dependencies of Rails? But there's still one problem. How do I bootstrap this? How do I get the first set of people to install these gems? Well, I tried to be popular. This is a screenshot from rubygems.org. I wrote a gem, and I decided to keep it on the most downloaded today list. So I let that script run. I kept it in the top 5 all day, but I only got 1 install. So being popular kind of sucks. Although, just the other night, I realized there might have been a bug in this, and it might have only been catching people who installed it as root. So maybe being popular is okay. But how else can I get people to install my gems? Conferences are a good way. People talk about gems at conferences. Even at this conference, like I've seen several, gems and libraries thrown around. Aaron talked about ThreadSafe. That's cool. Zach talked about Hub. Jerry talked about Event Machine. What gem could I present you to install? You're probably not going to install anything that I tell you now. But what about this gem? Maybe I don't even need to give a talk about a gem. Maybe I can just print out a bunch of business cards with its name on it and leave it around the conference. So how many people installed this gem? Everyone else is just shy or in the other room. Yeah, so that was me. So I'm super nervous right now, but yesterday morning, I was a wreck. I came down here early, before the conference started. I had all these cards in my pocket. And I was sneaking around looking for places where I could leave these cards. And even though I had talked to the conference organizer and they're like, oh, that's totally fine, you can do that, that's awesome. I was super nervous, sneaking around, placing cards here and there. I was shaking. I was so nervous that I had all these cards in my pocket. And in my pocket, I also had my room key for my hotel. I must have left my room key on one of the tables with the cards. So the big takeaway for me was I should never be a thief. I would just look so guilty and so nervous all the time, and I left evidence at the scene of the crime, so I shouldn't do this. But I did it, and some people picked it up, and some people installed it. Here's who installed it. I was hoping for a little bit more adoption, but 6 is pretty good. 6 people are pretty good. Is Evan here? Thank you for the pull request. I may incorporate that in my next one at the next conference. Yeah. So does anyone who installed this gem have gems of their own? If you did, I would have potentially owned those gems. Luckily for you, this doesn't do anything except for post your username to a server. It doesn't do anything else. If you looked at the GitHub account, like some people tend to do when they're researching a gem, you'd find code that looks perfectly good. There's nothing that says that what's on GitHub has to match what's on Ruby gems. You could point to a completely different repo. In this case, I just didn't push to Ruby gems for the past week as I added the hack in later. So I got 3.8% adoption. It's pretty good, not bad. So there is 155 people at this conference. If I took this idea to maybe RailsConf or RubyConf, tried it again, I might get a fairly good set of people installing this gem. So what now? How do we keep this from happening? There's a couple things we can do. We could start by signing all our gems. Hope that our private keys don't get compromised the same way I sold your gem cutter credentials. That would be one step. Of course, if you take that step, then you also have to install everything with -p high security. Has anybody ever done this? I haven't done this. I'm giving this talk. So this requires that all gems that you install are signed. Of course, all this cert stuff requires a high level of adoption. You want everything that you install to be signed. And it takes quite a bit of work to get there. Someone could fork Ruby gems and add some code to send notifications when gems get pwned. Basically, the gem pushes. So given the current way Ruby gems work, I can push new versions of your gems with your gem cutter credentials, and you'll have no notification. If it at least sent out an email, that would be useful. We could also start creating our own private gem repos. You can manually vet every single line of every gem that you want to install. Put them in this private repo and only install things out of this private repo. Sounds like a lot of work, but I've actually heard of some companies that are starting to do this now. And there's probably an opportunity here for a company to come along and basically do this as a service and provide private repos that they know are secure without malicious gems, that type of thing. We could do all that, and that's a lot of work, and that's probably what would be best, doing these types of things. But the one thing I'd like everyone to do is not do this at home. The Ruby community is awesome, kind, supportive. We have these conferences like this where everyone's so friendly. And let's keep it that way. Let's not go out and build these gems that do bad things. But from this talk, maybe take away the following few things. Don't install gems you don't need to. Favor writing code yourself. I don't know how many times I go on Stack Overflow and I'm looking for a solution to my problem, and the answer is, hey, install this gem that I wrote. It totally solves your problem. Whereas you could probably spend a little bit more time, write it yourself, and it would be better. And you wouldn't expose yourself to some of these security events. Pay attention to what your gems do. If you're installing a gem with RSpec matchers, they shouldn't be using C extensions. Monitor your system. So little Snitch and fseventer are the two that I talked about. Those are good tools to use. And read the source. All of these gems you could, if you read the source and the actual source, so not the one on GitHub, not the one that you see when you do the gem install, but by doing a gem fetch, a gem impact, read that source. And if you do that, and if you did that on any of these gems, you'd catch these things. There's one more gem, and right now there's no code up there, but I'm putting this together. Coal Mine Canary. And it basically takes all the hacks that I've presented today, or is going to take all the hacks that I've presented today, bundles them together, and allows you to do a little bit of pen testing, basically. So when you install this, it'll tell you, hey, I was able to modify your bash profile. Hey, I was able to hit this web service. Hey, I grabbed your gemcutter credentials, or even like SSH keys and known hosts. That's a good one too, right? So look for this one. Hopefully I'll post the first version of this sometime next week. The one last thing I'd like to say is conferences tend to inspire me. So I go home from a conference and I have all of these gems that I want to install. I have all these ideas of projects. I have these different frameworks that I want to try on my projects. I want to, do all these things. I hope this talk doesn't do that to you. I hope you guys don't go home and write malicious gems. But I hope it was entertaining and eye-opening. Thank you.